Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I won't mention by name because I will tend to forget the names of so many excellencies and distinguished gentlemen and ladies who are here. So I just mentioned only the two previous speakers, Bapak Airlangga Hartarto yang saya hormati dan Bapak Arsyad Rashid yang saya hormati sebagai tuan rumah saya kira kali ini. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you all. It is my great pleasure to speak at this high-level gathering of experts, policymakers, and business leaders from this country and beyond. The organizers have asked me to talk about good economic governance in the context of Indonesia's experience. Before I begin, let me mention some caveats. I've been out of action, so to speak, for more than a decade now, so I'm not the best person to talk about the latest issues of the day. Pak Airlangga is the one. Instead, I will use the next few minutes to look back in time and recount an episode when economic governance in this country was, in my view, at its best. A situation never preceded before, nor replicated so far. My hope is that the story might give us clues as to the basic principles of good economic governance. The principles that are as relevant then as they are now for the conduct of economic policymaking in this country. The era in our history which I'm referring to started in the early 1970s and lasted for more than 2 decades. During this period, Indonesia experienced remarkable social and economic progress. This was the period when, by good fortune, politics and technocracy joined forces to generate a conducive ambience of good policy making. In this period, the Indonesian economy grew on the annual average 6 to 7%, with the agriculture sector by around 4%, industrial sector by 10%, and for the first time since independence, the country could achieve self-sufficiency in rice in 1984, though unfortunately it could not be maintained thereafter. The social indicators such as poverty level, the Gini coefficient, people's access to schools and health centers also improved, while the overall economic stability was largely maintained until the onset of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, when our economy was going off track for quite some years after. It was an impressive episode in our economic history. No wonder international institutions such as the World Bank praised the conduct of the country's development policies as well as its macroeconomic management as exemplary. Ladies and gentlemen, let us dive into it. Let's start with our development policies. And this is what I observed and noted. When I began my work in Bappenas, the National Planning Board, in the early 1980s, the institution was at the height of its influence in the national economic policy making. Bappenas was in charge of the preparation of the 5-year National Development Plan, the RAPELITA, which set the country's development priorities every 5 years. Bappenas formulated the final plan after many stages of intense consultations and discussion with relevant ministries and agencies. So, why was such a plan needed? As I understand it, there was a strong consensus among policymakers at that time that development is a long-term, sequential, cumulative, and path-dependent process. Therefore, development efforts must consist of systematic, coordinated sequence of steps to reach the predetermined goals. Just like building a house. First, you build the foundation, and then on it, brick by brick, you erect the walls, and so it goes on. To do the job well, you need a good plan, and of course, a good team of builders. Ladies and gentlemen, crucially, Bappenas was also responsible for the allocation of important part of our national budget, the so-called development budget. Ministries and other national agencies prepared proposals of programs and projects. The proposals must then go through a procedure to prove that they fell within the priorities set in the RAPELITA. And after that, they must pass a series of technical feasibility tests to get budget allocation. The priority and feasibility tests as practiced then were meant to be the ultimate device to coordinate this project and programs across agencies and across time period, so that they all, in a coordinated manner, remain on the track that lead to the end goal. The system was meant to minimize the risk of costly policy U-turns and unproductive policy zigzags. I must say that this impression continues to linger in my memory until today. Let us now ask further question. Why such arrangements work? What institutional setups made that possible? Here we come to the factors conditioning the process of policy making, the soft infrastructure of economic policy making, if I may use that term. The first, in my view, the most basic element of the infrastructure was the presence, by the grace of luck, of a solid team of very capable economic technocrats ready to provide the government with rational advices on policies. Initially, the team consisted of senior economists from the University of Indonesia. But over time, it slowly grew into a wider network that included younger technocrats from different backgrounds. This team initiated, debated, and finally formulated major economic policy. It was the soul, so to speak, of economic policy management in this country during that period. The second and no less important factor was the fact that the team was able to gain the ear and support of the political power holders for their policy ideas and plans. And this is no small feat. In the history of developing countries, technocracy and politics do not cohere naturally. Often they do so because they are forced by circumstances, as in this country in the 1960s, when the problem of hyperinflation needed urgent solution. That collaboration between the two successfully ended the traumatic condition, and I think partly because of that success, the collaboration between the two continue in the subsequent period, but this time focusing not on inflation, but on initiating development for the country. The synergy between technocracy and politics was further strengthened by the absorption of the team members into the government, by placing them in key economic ministries and agencies. And with that, the condition for an effective coordination of policy ideas and policy actions was further assured. Underlying this were deeper political realities. First, there was a workable level of rapport and mutual trust between the president and the team. And second, the government, through its dominant position in the legislature, could count on the latter's support on its policy decision. This lack of checks and balances would pose considerable risk if the quality of the policies was questionable. But that would help the implementation if the policies were of good quality from the outset. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now turn to our experience in managing economic stability in that period. To be sure, the period was not free from the potential threats and instability. Threats of instability from outside and inside the country. The Cold War was on during the period with all its economic effects. Droughts were inherent risks for countries like Indonesia. So were the unpredictable ups and downs of the major export. I will not recount on many instances of how the country managed to survive challenges to its economic stability during this period, but only to highlight the general principle it adhered and practiced then. The first to mention is that there was a basic stance that the government held fast throughout the period, and that was fiscal prudence. It was then known as the balanced budget principle. In actual fact, the government budget were never balanced, but by any measure, they were always prudent. Deficits occurred, but they were always small. Why? Because the principle stipulated that any deficit could only be financed with soft or concessionary loans from international sources and never to be covered by loans from domestic sources, especially from the central bank, as the government did in 1960s with devastating effect on monetary stability. And of course, the amount of soft loans available at the time to borrow was always limited. Ladies and gentlemen, the principle was the mainstay of macroeconomic management during the period. It was complemented by another important practice that ensured the close coordination between fiscal and monetary policies. The coordination was done through an institution called the Monetary Board, whose membership included the finance minister, the governor of the central bank, the planning minister, and the minister for the economy. There, in the Monetary Board, the general stance of macroeconomic policy was discussed, formulated, and its implementation monitored. The arrangements provided an anchor of stability for the economy during the 2 decades we discussed. But then, the Asian financial crisis in 1997 struck and laid bare its shortcomings. As mentioned by the previous speakers, among the Asian countries, among the ASEAN countries, Indonesia was the worst affected by the crisis. There were several reasons for that. While the government was restrained by the rules, other players in the economy were not. Borrowings, especially foreign borrowings of the private sector and bank, grew beyond what was prudent, making the emerging foreign exchange scarcity because of the crisis worse. The subsequent closure of 16 small banks without safety measures triggered bank run. The foreign exchange crisis became a banking crisis. Inevitably, the chaos in the financial sector quickly spread to the real sectors, causing widespread layoffs. The situation was made worse by the arrival of El Nino that caused the price of basic staple food rise more than double in 9 months in the following years. Widespread unemployment, together with high food inflation, subsequently triggered a wider social political upheaval. What are the lessons from this experience? First and foremost is that it was a correct stance that prudent fiscal and monetary policies continue to be strictly maintained. We could not imagine how the situation could get much worse when this anchor was unhinged in those critical times. However, the experience also shows that you need to do more. You also need to monitor the financial prudence of players outside the government, namely the business and state enterprise sector and the banking sector, with regard especially to their exposure to their foreign borrowing and take early measures to keep them within limits of prudence. Outside the financial sector, the experience gives us lesson that unemployment rate and food inflation should be continuously monitored as they could form a lethal combination of in time of crisis. I now come to the last bit of my story about the era we are reminiscing. This is about the extraordinary development of the price of our major export, at the time oil, between 1973 and 1980. The average price of Indonesian oil price per barrel rose more than tenfold, from around $3 per barrel to around $35 per barrel. How did we make use of this godsend bonanza? And this is what we did. True to the postulate in Economics 101 that says that economic rents should belong to the society and to be used to the benefits of the whole society, the government at the time worked its best and succeeded through innovative policies to capture most of the economic rent. The collected funds were then channeled through the established budgetary process to provide financing for the programs and projects in Rapelita. The result, as I mentioned earlier, were exemplary. Among the oil exporting developing countries at that time, Indonesia's performance stood out, and international institutions such as the World Bank gave a big thumb up. Ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia is a country blessed with varied natural resources. From time to time, the world prices of these commodities shoot up, creating temporary but often large windfalls. To reap the best benefit from them, the government should always have at hand a system that would capture the economic rents as they appear, or lose it. It should also have a priority cum disbursement system. In our story, the Rapelita and its budgetary process, standing ready so that the windfalls could be channeled to projects and programs of highest national priority. Ladies and gentlemen, let me recap now my main point. First, beneficial policy outcomes could only come when technocracy and politics could be made to join force. With the technocrats assemble good, high-quality policy ideas and concepts, and the politicians their blessing and support for their swift implementation. Second, development is a long-term process. There is no shortcut to it. To achieve it, we must undertake systematic sequence of steps. For that, you need a good operational plan to impose discipline of coordination across agencies and across time period. Third, concurrently, the condition of economic and financial stability must be maintained. Here, the old wisdoms remain valid. Maintain prudent fiscal and monetary policies at all times. Make sure risk exposures of players outside the government sector remain within the safe limit. In addition, developments in the real sector, notably the unemployment rate and food inflation, should also be closely monitored and kept within limits. Fourth, establish operational systems that could effectively capture windfalls from commodity booms when they come, and then channel them to projects and programs of highest national priority. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I've come to the end of my talk, but I thought it might be fitting to close it with the following statement. History always has something to teach for those who are willing to learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Budiono, MEC, for the remarks and also showing us how we learn from the past experiences as well for Indonesia's future economic growth.